Okay, well, I'm very glad to be here. I really appreciate the chance to talk to this group. The Park Service, the parks in Alaska are just an incredible resource for the state and the nation. But I think we're facing some really interesting times. We're facing a situation with a warming climate, and that presents some new challenges. I found it really interesting to look at the mission for the Park Service, which is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and to provide for enjoyment of the same so as to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And I found this really interesting thinking about the rapid climate changes that are occurring in Alaska. It made me wonder, how is this possible to preserve these things if the climate that influences their basic properties is changing in a directional manner? And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. What can be the role of the national parks in a changing world? And so what I'd like to suggest is that we must accept that changes are going to occur, and that it's important to plan for change, but also that the parks could serve a really important role model for society in general in terms of learning how to live with change. So if we just look at some of the things that are happening right now, these are the recent trends for summer temperature in the circumpolar area. And as you can see in Alaska, it's warming as rapidly here in Alaska as any place on Earth. So this is bound to have effects on the wildlife and the nature in places like the parks of Alaska. Here's the trend specifically for Alaska over the last 70 years or so, and you can see that it's warming more rapidly now than it has been in the past. And the projections of climate models are that we should expect this to continue at least as rapidly, perhaps even more so in the future. Park visitors are increasing. There's several reasons for this. First of all, the population, both nationally and globally, is increasing. And also, as people transform the Earth's surface, the areas of wilderness are going to decrease. So if we have more people and less wilderness to visit, it's inevitable that there's going to be increased pressure on that wilderness that remains. And also, people have more leisure time than they used to. And I think there's always going to be an interest in being able to experience places like the national parks of Alaska. So it seems really likely to me that park visitation is going to continue to increase in the future, and this will bring increased pressures on the park from visitors. But not only park visitors. If we look at the population of Alaska, it's doubled every 20 or 30 years, and the projections are that this will continue into the future. So anytime there's increases in population, this is going to bring pressures for development in the region outside the park. So these are some of the projections of climate models of how things may change in the future. It's projected that over the next couple of decades, we may have twice as many really warm days as we've had recently, and that number of warm days is going to increase. So it's not just that the average temperature is increasing, but that the extreme events, the sorts of days that produce extensive wildfires, are going to continue increasing in the future. This will also bring changes in the winter time, so we should expect more winter thaw events. And if these are the sorts of conditions that produce icing events and make it more difficult for caribou to access winter forage, then this is going to create potential problems for wildlife. If we think about the glaciers of the world, most of the glaciers of the world are getting smaller, and the glaciers of North America are showing the most extreme trends. Most of these are glaciers in Alaska. And so these trends that we're seeing right here are certainly going to impact the glaciers in the parks and many of the things that visitors come here to see. All of these changes in climate are inevitably going to affect the biology that we're here to experience. This shows the trends on the North Slope. It's a satellite image of a greenness index, an index of the amount of greenness that occurs. And if you go from 1991 progressively through to 1999, you can see that the North Slope of Alaska has gotten progressively greener. More vegetation. If you look at things more closely from these aerial photographs taken 15 years ago and then more recently, you can see that the density of shrubs has increased. You can see many places here where there's a lot more shrubs than there used to be. The forests are expanding at the latitudinal and altitudinal tree lines. You can see this really clearly if you go out into the park here. And these expansion of trees and shrubs is going to have some really important impacts. First of all, just in terms of things that visitors come to see. It means that the vistas and the character of the landscape are going to continue to change from what they have been in the past. As we get more shrubs and trees, one of the things this does is to absorb more energy and transfer that heat to the atmosphere. So these vegetation changes are going to reinforce and amplify the changes in climate that are driven by processes that are happening globally. Another thing that seems to be associated with this is a reduction in the amount of lichen biomass, partly as a result of shading by shrubs. But not all of the changes are bad. One of the things that shrubs do is bring in, make the habitat more favorable for moose. But the basic message is that things are going to be changing, both in terms of vegetation and in terms of the animals. So what can Alaskan parks do about something like this? We have a substantial problem in that a lot of the human effects on warming have to do with human behavior that's dispersed globally. And these are contributing to the warming that's happening globally. And this warming that's happening globally is then amplified at high latitudes, which causes changes in ecosystems. And there's some feedbacks from this warming through the climate system back to the globe. But at present, this doesn't seem to be having a very strong effect on human behavior. So what is it that could be done in Alaska that might have some hope of influencing human behavior and some of the basic causes of the warming that's happened at high latitude? Well, I think one of the things that we can do is to demonstrate really clearly the consequences of warming and tell this story really convincingly to park visitors and to the public at large. Alaskan parks are some of the best examples of ecosystems that are in the process of dramatic change. So it's really important I think the parks can play a really important role in documenting and in telling the stories about change. And this is important, but I doubt that it's sufficient. If warming continues, I think there's other ways that parks need to begin to prepare for this. And I think part of this involves perhaps redefining in some ways the resources that are being protected for the future, the resources that future generations that we hope they'll be able to enjoy. So if changes are going to occur, this means there'll be changes in species composition, new arrivals, some disappearances. So perhaps that one of the ways we might think about this is to do what we can to prevent these changes from happening, but to recognize that many of these changes will occur, and to be thinking about preserving biodiversity and the functions that are associated with biodiversity rather than simply focusing on individual species. There's a lot of things that we don't know how to do in terms of preserving biodiversity in a general sense, but it might have to do with things like thinking very carefully about the migration corridors by which species arrive, thinking very carefully about the factors that tend to push species towards extinction, and thinking about how we can design migration corridors that are likely to promote the dispersal of species that are presently part of the landscape and discourage the dispersal of weeds and other species, other exotic species. I think we can think about preserving aesthetic values rather than preserving static landscapes. As I mentioned already, it seems really likely that tree line is likely to continue to shift and that there'll be other vegetation changes like that. And what is probably really important in terms of the role of the Park Service is not to preserve a specific landscape, but to preserve an opportunity for people to maintain their sense of identity with nature and with culture. So just thinking of landscapes as a dynamic feature that we want to preserve into the future rather than thinking of preserving them exactly as they are today. So all of these things means, in some ways, fostering rather than preventing changes that promote some of these dynamic values. And this, I think, gives us an opportunity to redefine the educational mission of the Park Service, to clearly identify some of the causes of change, to explain and tell other people about the processes that underlie these dynamics of change, and to make the connections between the processes that are happening so dramatically in the parks and the causes of these change that are distributed more globally. I think it also means that we'll need to think about managing for the long term and for large scales. One of the things I think we've learned in part through research that's been done in national parks is that disturbances play a key role in the way any sort of ecosystem works. They structure landscapes, they determine the probability of future disturbance events. And in turn, these landscape patterns that are structured by disturbance determine a lot of the nature of interactions of things that go on across landscape, the movement of fires across landscape, the movement of animals across landscape. And so we need to think about these broader landscape patterns in thinking about planning for the long term. We need to think about changes in fire regime that are likely to occur, the effect of these changes in fire regime on caribou habitat, for example, because lichens require something on the order of 80 to 100 years to recover after fire. So as fire becomes more frequent, then we need to think very carefully about how we can design fire or use fire in such a way as to preserve corridors for migration of animals like caribou. I just wanted to talk about some of the other kinds of changes that are happening. This is a graph that describes some of the patterns of changes in climate and as has been recorded in tree rings. This graph is a little bit confusing in the sense that warmer temperatures are shown being down and colder temperatures being up. So recently we're in a warmer trend, and this has been associated with, here looking at the growth of white spruce, it's been associated with a reduction in the growth of white spruce up to the present. And we can only guess what's going to happen in the future, but if we take this relationship of the past growth of white spruce, the drought-induced reductions in growth that are associated with climate warming, then we might project that white spruce would continue to decline in growth rate into the future, and at some point before the end of the century would be likely to show zero net annual growth. Well, something's likely to happen to white spruce before that happens. And in the Kenai Peninsula, one of the things that's happened and associated with warming is that the bark beetle, the spruce bark beetle, has shifted from a 2-year life cycle to a 1-year life cycle. So in response to a gradual change in warming, there's been a threshold change in the biology of this insect species and a threshold change in the nature of the interaction between the beetle and their host trees. And it's resulted in one of the largest insect outbreaks in North America, the largest naturally occurring insect outbreaks. Fire regime is changing. The area burned in Western North America has doubled in the last 40 years. 60% of the large fire events, the large fire years in Alaska, have happened since 1990 as a result of regional warming and drying. And as I was saying earlier, it's likely that we'll continue to see increased frequency of warm days that are associated with high likelihood of fire. Another thing that's been happening is that thermokarst and the thawing of permafrost has become more extensive. This is an area south of the Tanana River in interior Alaska. And so here is the Tanana River landscape of today. But you can imagine that sometime in the future it might be a very different thing, that these areas of black spruce might be areas of thermokarst. These areas of white spruce might be areas of beetle outbreak. That as a result of melting of glaciers, that there might be changes in river level and changes in river dynamics. So I think that it's quite likely that we're going to be seeing in many parts of Alaska massive changes in the landscapes that we see. It's not to say that these landscapes are going to be any more dysfunctional than the landscapes of today. It's just to say that they're different and that we should be thinking very carefully about how these changes are going to occur and how we can understand this changing landscape. Well, one of the ways one of the tools that we may have to think about managing this landscape is fire. This shows the area burned in 3 large regions of interior Alaska over the last decade or so, and then over the entire fire record. And one of the things that you can see is that the area around Fairbanks has had much less area burned than the Yukon Basin region or the area to the west around Galena. That's because there's more people around the Fairbanks area, which in some senses that's counterintuitive because people bring more ignitions, and there has been a lot more fires in the Fairbanks area than in other places. But at the same time, people are very good at putting out fires, and a lot of the area that's zoned for fire suppression in Alaska that's a high proportion of the area around Fairbanks. And so where people take action to suppress fires, they've in general been relatively successful in doing that. And so one of the things that's very innovative about the way fire is managed in Alaska is that there's some zones that are zoned for suppression, primarily around highly valued resources and where risk of fire to life and property is high. But then in areas where there aren't these risks, then fire is basically allowed to run its natural course, and the fires are observed and monitored, but generally not suppressed. So, but just knowing that if we do consider using wildfire as a way to, that if we do choose to put out wildfires, that this can, in a large number of the cases, be used as a way to reduce fire. It gives us some tools to manage fire on the landscape. We know that fire is going to be increasing. We know that in some cases this can have consequences that even in natural landscape could be something we want to seriously consider, such as reductions in the area of caribou habitat. So we could be that we want to think about using wildfire as a way to produce buffers that are likely to reduce likelihood of future wildfires. Here you can see an area of deciduous forest in the boundary line fires that occurred in 2004. Fire was encroaching on this patch of forest from all sides, and yet it didn't burn. There was no action taken to prevent it from burning, but it was just that deciduous vegetation has a high enough water content that it's really difficult for fires to burn through it. Now, one of the things that happens after fire is that you get early successional deciduous shrubs initially and then deciduous forests, and this can provide a buffer zone that will make it less likely that fires can burn through. So we can think about using natural processes to design landscapes in a sense, using fire in places where it is likely to make it less likely that future fires can pursue. So I think this is just one example of the way that we can use our understanding of natural processes that happen on the landscape and thinking about using this as a way to preserve resource values in the future. Another thing I think we need to think about in terms of parks is we need to think about managing the matrix. Rather than thinking of parks as postage stamps of things we want to preserve, we need to think about things that are impinging on parks from the side and ways in which the resources that are preserved in parks have an opportunity to move beyond them. So if we think about some of the interactions between parks and the matrix, some of these may be undesirable features associated with development and pollution. There's going to be disturbances such as fire that are likely to be a result of human ignitions occurring surrounding parks. And so if we just allow fires to burn, it could be that we'd end up having more fires in parks than we might otherwise expect. So we need to think about how to deal with these disturbances that are going to occur more frequently on the matrix that surrounds parks. Hunting of populations that migrate in and out of parks certainly has the potential to influence the wildlife dynamics, the population dynamics of wildlife in parks. And this is something that park managers are well aware of right now and are dealing with, in general, very effectively. Another thing I think that we can think about very carefully and where there's a chance for a lot of innovative thinking is about thinking about migrating, about corridors for species that are going to be changing their distributions as a result of climate change. One of the resources that parks have is some very dramatic climatic gradients over short spaces of distance. And I think this is going to be particularly important as climate change becomes more and more rapid. Now, migration of species has always occurred in response to variations in climate, but usually species have hundreds or thousands of years to experience a particular rate of climate change that over the coming decades is likely to be occurring over timescales of decades to centuries. So species that are adapted to be able to migrate and adjust to climate over these longer timescales are going to be faced with some real problems of adjusting rapidly to rapid climatic change. So I think one of the things that parks can do is to study these patterns of migration through the monitoring programs that are already in place, to understand what it is that causes changes in the distributions that we see in the parks, and to think how some of the desirable changes that we might see in distributions of species might be fostered by maintaining corridors that will allow some of these species to migrate. So this is an example of the way that I've been thinking about using parks as a way to understand the dynamics of change and to think about this as a positive attribute, something that we can contribute to an understanding of things more broadly. Just as I think parks, just because parks represent such an incredible landscape, they inevitably have impacts on the way people behave and think about things outside of the parks. It's an opportunity to partner with groups that in the areas surrounding parks to think about channeling the forces either for development or for conservation that are happening in the matrix outside of parks. But I guess the basic message is that the things that go on in parks are going to be very, very strongly influenced by things that are going on around them. And by simply looking at what's going on within parks, we're likely to miss the boat. We really need to think about managing the matrix, and that's going to require partnerships with groups that have a lot to do with things that happen in that matrix. I think it's the parks in Alaska have taken a real leadership role in redefining wilderness in a way that includes people. Many of the parks in Alaska, not all of them, but many of them have been set up in a way that allows for native peoples and people who live in the region to continue subsistence opportunities. And this is quite a change from what the Wilderness Act has defined as a place where man is a visitor and does not remain. So Alaskan parks have taken a real leadership role in this, but it's not an easy role to take because the patterns of subsistence use are changing. But I think the important thing that the parks have done is to provide an opportunity to show that people have always been an integral part of Alaskan wilderness and to provide an opportunity for that to continue into the future. Just looking at the maps of vegetation and the maps of language groups and cultural groups, you can see that they're virtually identical. And this is because people have a huge impact on the landscape, and the landscape has a huge impact on people. They really can't be separated. And so, knowing this, if parks are in the business of preserving landscapes, they inevitably have to be in the business of preserving the people and preserving the cultural roots that are associated with those landscapes. So just looking briefly at what's happened in Alaska over the last 20,000 years, people have been here for a large part of that time, the last 10,000 years or so. But as Europeans have come to Alaska, I think we tend to have sort of a sort of an unrepresentative view of the way things have been, because even before people were here in large numbers, diseases began to decimate native populations. And so all across North America, and including Alaska, when white people arrived and began looking at what they viewed as natural landscapes, they saw a very unnatural situation in which many of these landscapes that had developed in interaction with people were left with that landscape, but without most of their human residents. And I think this influenced the way in which the concept of wilderness has developed in North America. And Alaska is one of the few places where this new sort of a redefined view of wilderness has taken hold and is being promoted by the Park Service. So, for example, interior Alaskan Athabascan culture has been tied in with salmon for a long time. But now the technology of fishing for salmon has changed from what it used to be. And the technology for subsistence in general and for interacting with the land is very different than what it used to be. For example, 300 years ago, people in interior Alaska were mainly small family groups that traveled around seasonally in order to be able to utilize the landscape as effectively as possible. And when a large fire came through, they simply moved to a new area where the appropriate balance of resources were available for them to be able to live and do their subsistence hunting and fishing. Now people that are living a subsistence lifestyle are locked in place by infrastructure, by airports, by schools, churches, health centers, and so forth, schools. And so, and as fuel costs rise, then this restricts even more the extent to which people can move around on the landscape. And so I think about, when we think about the opportunities that people have for continuous subsistence culture, they have to find new modes of transport in order to be able to carry out the types of subsistence hunting and fishing that they've done in the past. Now this presents real challenges for the Park Service that's trying to manage wildlife populations, in part through restrictions on types of access to parks. So I don't have an answer to this. I just want to say that it's not a simple question, and there's not likely to be a simple answer to it. So here, for example, if you look at the way in which various types of animals change following fire, These are general patterns that hunters in various villages through interior Alaska have observed in terms of patterns of wildlife, changes in wildlife at times after fire. And you can see that some wildlife resources come back really quickly, just a few years, and you begin to get berries. Moose and marten seem to peak about 15 to 30 years after fire. As I mentioned earlier, caribou require something on the order of 80 to 100 years to really come back after a fire. So wildlife managers, when they look at a slide like this, say, well, we have to maintain fire on the landscape in order to maintain this diversity of wildlife. Now think of yourself as a subsistence hunter who's locked in place by infrastructure. It's a generation before moose come back to that landscape. So they're going to have a very different perception of the meaning of fire. And I think that as we think about the management of landscapes and think about using fire as a tool to manage these landscapes, or even thinking about how the changes in fire are going to influence people, even if we don't choose to manage that actively, then we're in for some very major changes. And so I think we need to think in a very landscape-oriented fashion about the way in which we manage landscapes in the future, because they have really important implications not only for scenic resources, but for cultural resources as well. Each one of these sets of bars represents a different village in interior Alaska, and it just shows the relative dependence on moose in some villages versus caribou in other villages. So different villages are going to be differentially affected by changes in fire regime. So Alaskan wilderness, I think, is quite likely to change. There's going to be changes in climate and disturbance regime, changes in biodiversity and species composition, changes in subsistence use, both in the intensity of that use and in the type and technology of use. There's likely to be changes in the use by non-residents, both as a result of increased human population density and as a result of reductions globally in the extent of wilderness. And as wilderness declines, there's going to be an increase in the importance of non-use, or of non-consumptive use of wilderness. As more and more people move into cities, wilderness is going to take on a different meaning to a large proportion of people. Within a decade or two, half the world's population is going to live in cities. They're not going to see on a day-to-day basis what it means to be tied to the land in the same way that people do who live in the parks or live nearby parks or who spend a lot of time in parks. So this provides a new educational opportunity and challenge for the parks to work with people who are going to have a very different concept of how they relate to the ecosystem services that the world provides to them. To residents also, I think these changes mean, as I've said, a change in their lifestyle. So I think one of the things this means is sitting down with people who live on the land, sitting down who are facing exactly the same issues that the Park Service is facing, and sitting down together as groups of individuals, and as groups that represent larger efforts to think creatively about ways that we can deal with these challenges. So I think there's lots of things to figure out, but there's lots of opportunities to think collaboratively about how to do this. One of the things that's always impressed me in talking to people in rural Alaska is that these people are really proud of their ability to adapt to change. The only reason they're there today, the only reason they've been able to cope with the kinds of changes that have happened over centuries and millennia is that they're able to deal with changes. The salmon disappear for 5 or 10 years or 50 years. There's low population levels. This causes substantial changes, but these people have learned to cope with that, and they're really proud of their ability to be able to cope. They recognize the challenges of dealing with climate change, and they realize that they're going to have to rely on their skills at being able to cope with things. So I think this attitude of recognizing that change happens, that it's going to happen, and that they can deal with it is something that I think the rest of us have a lot to learn from. And so I think people living in interior Alaska represent a resource of knowledge, sort of a base of knowledge and experience and of appropriate attitudes that I think are going to be useful to the rest of us as all of us begin to struggle with the issues of how to cope with change. Well, change is not going to be simple. I've mentioned just a few of the kinds of changes that are likely to happen. But maybe the most important thing to realize is that none of these changes are going to happen in isolation. All of these changes are going to interact in some very complex and often unpredictable ways. And so it's exciting because it means that as an organization that's devoted to understanding the nature of the parks, the Park Service has a real opportunity to be in the forefront of learning about some of these complexities of adjusting to change. So I think it's going to be an exciting time as well as a challenging time. And I think what I've tried to talk about here is just a microcosm of what the world is facing globally. And I think it's a real challenge to think, how is it that we can build a sustainable future if the global environment is directionally changing, ecologically, economically, politically, and culturally? Now here I've emphasized just the changes in climate and the ecology, but these are in some ways just the smaller part of the changes that are happening globally. And these other global changes are equally directional, equally strong, equally influential, and are going to have equally large impacts on parks and the areas that surround parks. And so I think the challenges that the Park Service faces are perhaps even a less dramatic, less intense example of the kinds of changes that the whole world is going to face. And I think there's a lot of things that we're going to, it provides a lot of opportunities to play a constructive role in reducing the detrimental types of changes that are occurring and finding ways to explore constructive avenues of change. So I think given that things are changing so quickly, it's an opportunity for the Park Service to redefine or to refine in new ways some of its goals. It's always thought about preserving biodiversity, but that takes on a very new meaning now than what it has over the last century or so. The Park Service has always been concerned about preserving human connections to the land and sea, but that's going to involve a very different set of issues in the future than what it has in the past. And so preserving biodiversity, preserving human sense of connection to the land is going to require a very long-term, large-scale perspective where we don't know what the target is that we're aiming for. We don't know what the reference point is of what it is we're trying to preserve in terms of the specific species, the specific landscapes. But we do know a lot about the dynamics of change, and that's the kind of thing that I think we should be learning about, learning how to manage that effectively. It involves managing the matrix for the long term and protecting some of the avenues that will allow species to naturally move along gradients as climate changes. And Park Service, I think, has some really important roles in shaping these changes in terms of showing what's happening, and in developing partnerships to foster cultural adjustment and cultural change, rather than thinking of culture as being a static element as well, and exploring new models for society globally to think of living with change, because it's something all of us are going to have to face. So thank you.